Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Or rather, you're watching this, so you're probably a Trails fan, which means I should be wishing you a happy Trails through Daybreak 2 release date, because that's the more important of the 2 days for you. Honestly, there are many worse ways to spend February 14th than hanging out with Van Arkride. Like, he obviously also doesn't have anything going on today, and I'm pretty sure if you offer him enough candy, he will agree to go on the one date with you. Anyway, a very notable thing about Daybreak 2's localization is that it's coming out only a little over 8 months after Daybreak 1's. This is the shortest period of time between any 2 official Trails localizations, with 2 exceptions that have a lot of caveats to them. The first and earlier one was Trails of Cold Steel 2 and Trails in the Sky III, which came out in September 2016 and then May 2017, which were effectively handled by 2 completely different teams, and when compared to the games that directly come before them, Cold Steel 2 came out about 9 months after Cold Steel 1, so a bigger gap than the Daybreak games, and Sky III not only came out a year and 7 months after Sky Second Chapter, but Second Chapter's localization was so famously rough a process that they not only skipped the 2 Crossbell games to go straight to Cold Steel, and even started on Cold Steel, getting both of the first 2 games out before Sky Third was done, and then Xseed straight up lost the license for any new Trails games after that. The other example is when the Crossbell games were finally able to get official releases. Zero came out about 6 months before Azure, though this only happened because both of those games' scripts were very heavily based on the Geofront Group's fan translations of the 2 games, which were released about a year apart from each other before being bought and turned into the official scripts by NIS America, the current Western publisher of the majority of the series. The entire saga of why Trails localizations are considered cursed in the first place is a much longer story than I have time to talk about here, but we've gone from the series not being localized at all until several years after the first games came out, Second Chapter's localization being one of the most legendarily hard processes of all time in the industry, switching publishers midway through the Cold Steel arc, the scare caused by the initial Ys 8 localization, multiple fan translation groups working on parts of the series, some of them getting elevated to work on official games and others getting unpersoned out of the entire Falcom community, and all sorts of things to get to where we are now with Trails through Daybreak 2. As we stand, this is the closest localized Trails games have ever been to being fully caught up. The only game in the series without an official localization yet is Kai no Kiseki, which came out in September of last year, and, well, Daybreak 2's localization's been done now. There's a good chance they're already working on that. There have been times when the series was almost caught up to the most recently released game in Japan, but because Zero and Azure had never been localized, there was always that Crossbell gap, and it wasn't until only a year or so before the official versions came out that fan translations of high quality for both of those games even existed. These issues were aggravated by the fact that NIS America's localizations, which started with Cold Steel 3, were of noticeably lower quality than the ones published by Xseed Entertainment, who handled the Sky Trilogy and the first 2 Cold Steel games. This, on top of the gap between Cold Steel 2 and 3, plus the additional gap of them releasing their official Crossbell games, meant that by the time of Trails into Reverie, the games were coming out 3 years after they did in Japan, and on top of that, NISA also began taking down fan translations for games they would not be releasing their versions of for another 2 years, making it very difficult for someone who had already caught up on the series by the time they took over it to both stay caught up and maintain the hype levels they had before. This seems to have changed a lot in 2024 and now 2025. As the first Trails Through Daybreak's localization, while it did still release almost 3 years after the original Japanese version, the localization itself is of a substantially higher quality, having none of the QA issues that plagued Cold Steel 4 and Reverie, being more accurate and more well-written than any previous NISA Trails game, which largely seems to stem from the fact that Daybreak's localization staff is more or less an all-star team pulled from almost every group that's translated Trails games before, with the only notable exception being the Zero Field fan translation group, who was responsible for the fan TLs of Reverie and Daybreak 1, and had just announced that they'd be covering Daybreak II before their entire group got DMCA'd out of existence. For every bad name change or weird line in Daybreak 1 and the demo for Daybreak 2, I can either hand wave it away by saying this is something they screwed up in an earlier game and just have to keep using for consistency purposes, or I can match with something really, really good from the Daybreak localizations, like picking a random one of Aaron's lines, any scene where Ven is exasperated, or the fact that they somehow legitimately managed to get away with calling Maxim Lugan the Red Comet in the dub, which even the fan translations didn't do, and they don't have to worry about getting around copyright issues with other franchises. Yeah, his Japanese title is Akai Ryusei instead of Akai Suisei, but I'm pretty sure that was done for copyright reasons in Japan. But no, here in the land of the free, we do apparently have cringe fail Ferrari driver Char Aznable, which I am going to very tentatively pen down as a good thing in terms of localization, but not something that should probably ever actually exist. But Luxon, you might be thinking, quality is only one thing that matters here. Daybreak 2 still came out 2 years and 5 months after its Japanese version, so why does any of this matter? Well, allow me to explain. First off, the rest of the video is going to be predicated on the assumption that Daybreak 2's localization is of the same standard of quality that Daybreak 1's was. If they backslide back to how the previous Nisa Trails games came out, then we're having a completely different conversation. But based on what I've played of the demos, it is in as good hands as the last game was, so I don't think we'll need to worry there. Before looking at anything anyone who actually works on the game said, we need to just pay attention to Falcom's release schedule. This is the company that releases one major title every single year, and due to its popularity and the quantity of storytelling that needs to be done before the series can be finished, the vast majority of those in recent years have been Trails related. Except, starting with the Japanese release of Daybreak 2, they've slowed down their release pace of new Trails games considerably, which is providing a big opportunity for Nisa to fully catch up. If we go back to the first games localized by Nisa, Cold Steel 3 was the 2017 release and was localized in 2019, Cold Steel 4 was the 2018 release and localized in 2020. Then East 10 was the 2019 release and was localized in 2021, but earlier in the year, so it was about 1 year and 5 months after the Japanese release as opposed to a full 2 years, which of course makes sense. Trails games are so daunting to localize because of the absurd amount of text in each one of them, so East games will always be quicker. Then after that, Falcom went on a bit of a roll with new Trails games. Reverie was their 2020, Daybreak 1 was their 2021, and Daybreak 2 was their 2022. This unprecedented triple header of new Trails games, combined with Nisa effectively taking a year off from actually doing Reverie in order to catch up on games that both they and Exceed had previously passed over, is the primary contribution to the slippage from 2 years delay to 3. After that though, things change. Yeah, we're only just getting their 2022 game today, but their 2023 game was East 10, and the localization of that is already out. It only took about 13 months from the Japanese release. So they got East 10 out 4 months faster than they did East 9, with comparable if not better quality. Their 2024 game was of course Kai no Kiseki, the currently only unlocalized Trails game. And then, extremely surprisingly, even though early in 2024 they teased a sequel to 2015's Tokyo Xanadu, and Falcom has a history of releasing a Xanadu game every 10 years, they have instead already confirmed that their main title for 2025 is going to be Trails in the Sky First Chapter, the full 3D remake of the original Trails in the Sky, with an updated Atlas-style re-release of East 10 called East 10 Proud Nordics also coming out in Japan this year. The Sky remake, in addition to also looking amazing, which is a topic for a different video, is going to be the first simultaneous worldwide release by Falcom. And on top of that, is being published by Gung Ho Entertainment in the West, meaning Nisa is not on the hook for that. And since Falcom almost exclusively releases their flagship title for the year in mid to late September, the earliest we could reasonably expect a brand new Trails game that Nisa would be handling the localization for is September 2026, or over a year and a half from now, meaning they have a year and a half to localize Kai no Kiseki in order to be fully caught up by the time the next game releases in Japan. And given the fact that Daybreak II came out 9 months after Daybreak 1, it is pretty reasonable to assume that they'll be able to get Kai out within 18 months. Yeah, Proud Nordics is also there, but it's an expansion to a game that already had a lot less text than any individual Trails entry. I think that can be thrown in there too without much issue. If that wasn't already promising sounding enough, we can add several statements by key developers on the series to the pile as well. All of these were in interviews in the latter half of 2024 and will be linked in the description. The first is from an interview Push Square did with Falcom's president Toshihiro Kondo, and one of the questions asked was, Trails has come so far in terms of global popularity as well. The series has never been more accessible or as popular, especially here in the West. Is that newfound success important to you and Falcom? The response was, yeah, for sure. I mean, from a pure sales perspective, you've reached a point where the combined regions of Asia and the West as a region, the sales are greater than Japan, about 60% of the overall sales. So, the West has become a market that really can't be ignored. For example, nowadays, whenever we release news, even if it's Japanese news, a lot of times the very first people to comment on a tweet or video are foreign players who aren't Japanese. It's really important for us as a company to keep those players in mind, particularly because, obviously, you have the sales aspect of it, but also the fact that 20 years ago, especially in the West, JRPGs weren't as mainstream as they are now, or at the very least, they weren't as widely played. So over the years, we've seen more and more Western players become interested in the Trails series and begin to give feedback. And that's something that's really special, something that we really want to keep in mind going forward. So absolutely, the foreign users are very important to the company as a whole, and they are people that we keep in mind as we create the games. Now, Kondo has said something like this almost every time he's been asked a similar question for years, and it's always kind of come off as disingenuous PR speak because it really didn't seem like Falcom cared about Western fans all that much. In fact, it's been stated before that NISA was not allowed to touch the scripts of games to start localizing them until after Falcom released that game in Japanese, when, the reason a lot of other game localizations don't take 3 years is because the localizers have access to the working script as it's being written and can start localizing long before the game goes gold. That being said, this is easily the most detailed and most nuanced response Kondo has ever given on the topic, providing actual figures and acknowledging the non-Japanese Asian market, which not only is a fairly substantial part of both their revenue and the online fan base, but also already a market that gets early localizations. For recent games, Korean and traditional Chinese localizations have come out date and day with the Japanese, courtesy of Clouded Leopard Entertainment. The only caveat being their PC ports are notoriously lower quality than the NISA ones, for reasons I'll talk about in a bit, which has led to NISA actually acquiring the PC rights to the Japanese script, meaning not only will you find 2 versions of the same game, one called Kuro no Kiseki and one called Trails Through Daybreak on the Steam store, but the Japanese script is actually under Trails Through Daybreak and not available on the version of the game on PC that came out first by well over a year. Clouded Leopard's East 10 port was disastrous, while NISA's was completely fine, and it seems like this same status quo has been continued with Kai no Kiseki as its Clouded Leopard PC version came out fairly recently. However, Falcom has already stated that although Clouded Leopard is handling localization and publication for non-Japanese Asian markets, the PC port of Trails in the Sky First Chapter is going to be handled in-house. So, depending on the quality of that, this issue may have been resolved as well. That's good, but what's even better is it seems like the policy I talked about before has changed somewhat with recent games, and NISA is finally allowed to start the localization process before the game comes out in Japan. In an interview with French outlet Game Cult, Kondo was asked a certain question, which was translated and published in a Noisy Pixel article aggregating several pieces of Falcom information from late 2024, including a few other things I'll be talking about today. The question was, it seems Falcom has been pushing for Western localizations a bit faster recently, notably for the East series. The 10th is releasing in the West only a year after the Japanese release. Additionally, the Trails in the Sky remake is scheduled for global release in 2025, a first for Falcom. Can we hope that Falcom will catch up on the delay in localizing the Trails series now that the Crossbell Arc games, Zero and Azure, have been globally released? Kondo's response: it is true that until now there have been many gaps between the Japanese and Western releases. We worked on this a lot. Our partnership with NISA has allowed us to accelerate the process for the East and Trails series. Until now, we had a different process. We would only start discussing with them after the game had been released in Japan, which took a while. Nowadays, we are in contact with NISA far earlier, during development, which allows us to work faster and have shorter delays. On top of that, to discuss the features exclusive to the NISA PC version of East 10, RPG Site interviewed Durante, the legendary Dark Souls modder turned JRPG porting wizard, and representative of PH3, the studio NISA contracts out to do all their Falcom porting work, and basically the reason the NISA PC versions of all their Falcom games are head and shoulders above the Clouded Leopard versions, and also why the NISA Switch versions of Falcom games sometimes come out before the Falcom in-house versions and are sometimes even better than those. One of the questions asked in this interview was, how was the process for the team at PH3 handling East 10 Nordics compared to East 9 Monstrum Nox, the last series entry you handled on PC? I will not be reading all of this because most of it is specifically relevant to the East series, but one very important paragraph is, perhaps the biggest change to the workflow overall for this project is that NIS America does their localization programming and integration in-house. They do this by directly working on our hosted repository, which means that all platforms are much more closely aligned in terms of localization and can be updated more rapidly, both during QA and afterwards. This is a great improvement going forward and should lead to faster, as you can already see with East 10, and higher quality localizations out of the gate. So, it seems that not only has Falcom finally joined the 21st century and started providing all of their international localization partners the script prior to the Japanese release of the game, but NISA itself has also restructured how it handles things in the localization process on a technical level, as well as a writing and staffing one. And this is still very relevant to Trails because East 10 uses the same Falcom-developed engine that was debuted in Daybreak I, so many of the advances held on this front are going to carry over into future Trails localizations. The most explicit and perhaps most exciting statement comes from later in the Push Square interview I mentioned before, as Alan Costa, an associate producer with NIS America, was also present and answered a couple localization-related questions. He was asked, on the localization and publishing side of things, what's actually changed to speed up the whole process? Now, he doesn't really give a lot of specifics, and many things he talks about are things that I already mentioned, i.e. talking about the difficulty of localizing Trails games, and then a lot of self-admittedly tooting his own horn talking about the amount of Falcom stuff NISA's localized in the past year, but the ending of the response is the most important. So, we've found a way where we've really been able to cut this localization time down. He never specifies what way it is, but I think we can glean from the other interviews what it is. The goal right now is, essentially, we want no more than a year between the Japanese release and our release for the Trails games. And if we can continue to get that down even more, we will. And then for the East Series too, if you look at the Japanese release for East 10 and then Western release, it's about a year. But the goal someday is we'd like to get that down as small as possible. And if we can do 6 months, that'd be great. Still, yeah, we've definitely figured out, internally, some systems for how we can get cracking on those games as soon as possible, maintain quality, and bring them out as quickly as we can in the West. This sounds pretty good and pretty promising, again, assuming Daybreak 2's quality is similar to Daybreak 1, and Kai does come out sometime pretty soon, but there are still a few catches, and that's why there is an asterisk in the title. Yeah, Trails is going to be caught up. Yeah, everyone involved in localizing Trails for the West is committed to decreasing the gap, but is that good enough? The late 2010s and the 2020s so far have shown a massive increase in JRPG franchises, even the more niche ones, getting simultaneous worldwide releases for every new game in the series. A 1-year delay would have been perfectly reasonable for even a AAA JRPG not named Final Fantasy back in 2010. The original Xenoblade, for example, had a 14-month delay, and even in 2015, the original Xenoblade X had an 8-month one. And even the exponentially less wordy Pokemon series didn't go fully worldwide until 2013. But in 2025, that's not really cutting it. Atelier was a series that was basically around the same caliber of popularity as Trails until fairly recently, and albeit with the big caveat of nixing the dub, has been under 4 months delay since 2017. Most crucially, before the Ryza arc threw the series more into the spotlight, and therefore gave it more money to throw around for future localizations. Let me be clear here. The only Falcom games in the future that need to also be simultaneous worldwide releases are the remakes of the other 2 Trails in the Sky games. I'm neither saying nor expecting new Trails and East games to also get that treatment. I know that Falcom is a small studio with low budgets and only about 65 employees, plus they do not have the backing of a much bigger publisher like Gust has with Koei Tecmo. I'm aware that Clouded Leopard is also based in Japan, so they're much easier for Falcom to communicate with, and that localizing Japanese into Chinese is a lot easier than Japanese into English, as well as the fact that NISA does not only localize Falcom games. You know, they also kind of have to localize NIS games, and even Disgaea 7 had a delay of over half a year, so if NISA's able to get rid of the delay for one thing, it's probably going to be, you know, the NIS games. Under the current circumstances, and especially while retaining the dubs that are a pretty big draw and very well regarded by fans of dubbed Japanese media in general, it is not possible for at least Trails games to go simultaneous worldwide all the time, and that is okay. But also, come on. A decade ago, and before they stopped dubbing, Atelier games were also only 6 months behind, and quite frankly, 1 year is not good enough by Kondo's own logic. Eventually, and especially if they want to get the Trails series done by the end of this decade like Kondo keeps claiming he wants to do, they're going to have to go back to releasing Trails games multiple years in a row again. And the thing about Trails games is that the vast majority of them either end in a cliffhanger or end with some big climactic event that brings massive change to the world. And in both of those cases, the next game after that is going to have to pick up on those things that happened, which means even the initial advertising for such a game is by necessity going to be laced with spoilers for the game before. This then causes an issue. Let's say when they get around to ending the series, Falcom makes the final arc a 2-parter releasing in subsequent years. The Legend of Heroes, Kiseki no Kiseki, and soon after, NISA, who has been completely caught up on the series, and releasing their localizations of new Trails games at most a year after the Japanese version for several games now, says that they'll be localizing it under the English name Trails Beyond Miracles. What happens then? Well, in the first year, Falcom releases Kiseki no Kiseki 1 as their flagship title in September. Obviously, because this is the penultimate game in the series, a lot of big things happen, and it ends on a cliffhanger, going into the true finale in about a year's time. At this point, NISA has already been localizing the game for a while, and in November of year 1 are able to announce that Trails Beyond Miracles 1 will be releasing in, say, July of year 2. That is still a problem. Kiseki no Kiseki 2 will come out about 2 months after Trails Beyond Miracles 1, which means Falcom will be picking up the advertising, putting out a lot of trailers and information before Western fans, who are still paying attention to their Japanese-only announcements, will get their hands on the first game in the duology. Under this 1-year system, it is still extremely likely that Western fans will get spoiled on a game before it gets released in the West because of Falcom's own advertising for the game that comes after it. The solution for NISA is to either get even faster and say, have Trails games between 6 to 8 months delay and East 3 to 4, or for Falcom to never release Trails games in back-to-back years again, which, in addition to potentially killing narrative momentum, means the series is going to end so much later than Kondo seems to want it to. Yeah, games are probably going to end up getting split several more times before the series ends, and that's an inevitability, but if you had to wait 2 years between every game that gets split that way instead of 1, you're going to lose interest, and then they're not going to finish the series at all because sales completely drop off a cliff. If 60% of sales come from outside of Japan, and Falcom internally seems to divide them between the rest of Asia and the West, and the rest of the Asian markets they tend to care about are already getting simultaneous release, they really need to get the West as close to that as possible, or they will just ruin the experience for not only that player base, but everyone who's a fan of the series as a whole, and that's not something I want to happen. Calvert is already one of my favorite arcs. I haven't even played Kai yet, they haven't even announced Kai 2 yet, and I don't want this momentum to die out or the series to end on a low note. It may sound a little counterintuitive, but in my opinion, the best possible scenario for localizations going forward in the next couple of years is for Nisa to finish Kai and then sit on it a little bit. That's because if we just, for argument's sake, say they manage to localize Kai and get it out 9 months after Daybreak II, like Daybreak 2 was 9 months after Daybreak 1, it would be coming out in October. And that's a bad thing because the Sky First Chapter remake is almost certainly coming out worldwide in September. And 2 Trails releases right next to each other, they're going to cannibalize each other. And fan hype that non-fans will see is going to get confused and muddled, which is definitely something you don't want to happen with this niche of a series and this good an entry point for new fans as the Sky remake is going to be. I know Nisa doesn't have the best history when it comes to playing nice with Falcom games that were localized by other studios. They still don't want you to play Cold Steel 1 and 2 and to just start with their Cold Steel 3, but they really need to take the L on this one and, in all honesty, probably put their Kai back in early 2026, like about this time next year, if not a couple months later, to allow the Sky remake to breathe. New fans who get into the series with the Sky remake are going to want to play more games in the series. They are eventually going to catch up to Nisa's games. They're going to get a lot of sales in their back catalog as a direct result of the Sky remake succeeding. And then eventually those fans will fully catch up to the series and be able to play the new Nisa localized Trails games as soon as they come out in English. They will profit in the long run if the Sky remake series succeeds, so it is in their best interest to delay Kai out of conflicting with that release, and I hope they realize this, or I hope Falcom at least realizes this and tells them to move Kai back a bit. And then if Kai 2 comes out in September 2026, and we'll just say that Nisa is able to hit the 1-year delay goal immediately with that game, they will have Daybreak 2 in February 2025, then the Sky remake in September of 2025, the Kai 1 localization in early to mid 2026, and the Kai 2 localization in about September 2027. If Kai is pushed back from being right next to the Sky remake, there's also less of a gap between Kai 1 and Kai 2, and you'll have 4 Trails games spread out a lot more evenly across 3 years, which will allow the series to be in much more constant discussion in fan spaces, which is how fandoms for such niche series like this one grow, and again, how you get more sales in the long run. I know after all that I've said, it is very counterintuitive and kind of weird to suggest that the best thing for Nisa to do is to sit on a completed Kai for 4 to 6 months, but if we combine all that I've talked about with the fact that their main game for 2025 is a remake of a game that, as far as we can tell, is going to have mostly the same script as the original did 21 years ago, there's a good chance they are already writing some parts of Kai 2, which might mean that Nisa will also be able to start localizing Kai 2 faster than they would in any other scenario, which could even mean that they'll get under the 1-year mark for Kai 2, and even if they're not able to keep up that exact speed for the next game, are in a very good position for the rest of the series, and ultimately, the long run is what matters here. The one time besides a Sky remake where I think it would be appropriate to push for simultaneous worldwide release is the very last game, so every Trails fan around the world is able to play the final entry and learn the fate of Zemuria and all these characters we followed for so many games and so many millions of words at the same time. I know that's a bit of wishful thinking, but I think it is theoretically possible, and if it's theoretically possible, it's something worth striving for. I know some of the less scrupulous among you have been yelling this in the comments the entire video, but no, AI is not the solution here. Some of you have never seen the original Ys 8 localization, which is miles worse than even the worst bits of any NISA Trails game, and is responsible for a lot of the concern and outrage over them taking over from Xseed in the first place, and it really shows. Unfortunately, Falcom partnered with an AI translation company, feeding Kai no Kiseki lines into their model, and even held a joint exhibition at Tokyo Game Show 2024, where people could vote on which AI translated lines sounded better. On top of that, Kondo gave an interview with 4Gamer where he praised the potential of AI translations, saying that it might speed up the process of localization, and somewhat implied, at least for machine translating the interview, that it might be necessary for the series to catch up in the West. And while he does go on to say that artists and visual designers are nervous about the use of AI because, it literally has been stealing their work ever since it became a publicly available tool, he also said, it's a different situation from translation, so I'd like to explore AI in a way that humans aren't affected. Humans will be affected by AI translations. He thinks that it will be good for the fans if it happens, as if this will be a higher quality than a good quality human translation, and also literally says, some people may lose their jobs temporarily, but overall I think society in the future will enjoy the benefits of AI. This is especially true for game development. Now, obviously, everything I said will become so much more dire, and I will drop the series entirely if they start introducing AI translations for any of their games. You can't with good conscience look at the Northern War Gacha Games translation and then say that's a good idea for the main Trails series, the games that actually matter. That being said, I don't think we should start dooming about that quite yet, because this interview with 4Gamer was released October 22nd, 2024. And the Push Square interview I mentioned earlier was released October 16th. And if we go back to NISA associate producer Alan Costa's comments on localization speed and how to improve that in the future, he has a much different outlook to Kondo, and I think Kondo might have been in the room as he said this, so that could be a good sign in terms of the relationship between these two companies. Earlier in the statement to what I read out before, he says, "What we've done is essentially figured out systems for how we can attack and approach the games from a localization standpoint to be able to efficiently and accurately localize them. Because for us, the most important thing is to maintain a high level of quality while bringing the games out quickly. Because I don't think it necessarily serves anybody, neither Falcom or especially the players, if we run the game through, ChatGPT or something and then throw it out there. Who needs that? That doesn't do justice to the games, and at the end of the day, even if a game does come out faster, no one's happy about it because you lose all the glory and the beauty of what's in the original." Am I still annoyed at NISA's handling of the Zero Field situation, and do I still have nitpicks about their current localizations? Yes, but would I rather the localization process of the series be in the hands of someone with that philosophy or a machine? I will take the human 10 times out of 10. Especially if they've been talking about reaching and maintaining a high standard of quality and managed to hit that in much less time than it took Kondo to stop yapping about it and actually commit to making things better for Western fans. I'm still going to be playing Kai via a fan translation of the Clouded Leopard PC port, and don't feel particularly compelled to double dip on the official version like I didn't with Reverie or the first two Daybreaks, but who knows? If they manage to get the localizations fast enough and keep the quality high enough where the only fan translation that there's time to get out before their official version is an edited MTL or a straight plugging into ChatGPT like Kondo seems to want, we might be singing a very different tune come 2027. Until next video that you watch, be it something about the Trails in the Sky remake or something Xeno related, this is Luxon, signing off.